Every wall you see in a museum photograph, every siege described in a history book, every battle that ended an empire or started one, none of it happened the way you were told. Not because the dates are wrong or the names are made up, but because the version you learned left out the most important thing: the engineering, the physics, the brutal, gorgeous, terrifyingly precise science of how human beings built structures to protect everything they loved, and then invented machines to tear those structures apart. You grew up thinking ancient warfare was chaos, armies crashing together in open fields, screaming, hacking, dying. That's not what decided the ancient world. What decided it was a beam of oak the right length, sinew twisted to exactly the right tension, a ramp built from exactly the right number of stones hauled by hands that history forgot to name. The men who engineered those conquests were the most dangerous people alive, and almost nobody knows how they actually worked. That changes right now. We're going to go inside the stone, inside the machines, inside the physics of ancient annihilation. And by the end of this, you will never look at a crumbling wall or a museum model of a catapult the same way again. Because the real story isn't about kings, it isn't about glory. It's about the geometry of force, the chemistry of glazed brick, the mechanical genius hiding in a rope of twisted hair, and the anonymous people who figured all of it out with nothing but fire, math they didn't have words for, and time they were rapidly running out of. Before we go any further, if you're watching this and you find yourself leaning forward, genuinely needing to know what comes next, hit subscribe. That button costs you nothing, and it tells us to keep making videos exactly like this one. Drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? We've had people watching at 2 in the morning from places we've never expected, and every single one of them stayed until the end. Let's see where you are now. People watching at 2 in the morning from places we've never expected, and every single one of them stayed until the end. Let's see where you are now. Let's go back to the beginning, to a time when the word engineering didn't exist yet, but the need for it was already a matter of life and death. Picture a valley, somewhere in the Near East, roughly 10,000 years ago. The air smells of limestone dust and dried grass. The sun is a physical weight pressing down on a group of people who have decided, for reasons archaeologists are still arguing about, to stop moving, to stay, to build something permanent in a world where nothing had been permanent before. The site we now call Tel es-Sultan, better known as Jericho, is one of the most startling archaeological places on Earth, widely considered the oldest continuously inhabited city in existence. And while its famous biblical walls tend to grab all the headlines, the archaeological reality reveals a story of engineering that predates the invention of writing by thousands of years. Think about that for a second. These people, no iron, no wheel, no written language, no blueprint, no engineering school, no accumulated textbook knowledge, decided to build a wall. Not a fence, not a wooden stockade you could burn down on a bad day, a wall. And they built one that would still be visible from the surface of the earth 100 centuries later. Archaeologists found a massive stone wall standing over 3.5 meters high and almost 2 meters thick at its base. It was constructed of undressed stones, raw rock, shaped by muscle and nothing else, yet sturdy enough to protect a community of roughly 2,000 people. And to further reinforce their position, the builders hacked a ditch out of solid bedrock, measuring more than 8 meters wide and nearly 3 meters deep. Hacked out of solid bedrock, with tools made of flint and bone, no dynamite, no power equipment, just the slow, grinding, astonishing patience of people who understood something at a gut level that took the rest of the world millennia to put into formal language. A good defense is better than a fast retreat. Here's what nobody talks about when they mention Jericho. There's a question that has genuinely puzzled archaeologists for decades, and it never makes it into the tourist brochures. Scholars actually debate what those first walls were even for. Some argue they protected against human invaders. Others propose they were built to guard against flash floods from the nearby wadi. Either way, their construction reflects a society already capable of large-scale cooperation, and something that looks remarkably like urban planning. A defense against floods. Think about that alternative. The very first walls in human history might not have been weapons at all. They might have been a desperate, brilliant answer to nature's violence. And then somebody realized, standing on top of one, looking out at the valley below, that the same structure that kept water out would keep enemies out too. One technology, two purposes. The engineering logic was identical, only the threat was different. The oldest walls found in existence, separate from Jericho, are those of the temple of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dating back 11,500 years. 11,500 years. The Roman Empire, the entire span of it, is barely 500 years. Greece at its height, a few centuries. The Egyptian dynasties, impressive as they are, just a few thousand years. The impulse to build a wall, to draw a line in stone and say, "Inside here is mine," is so old it predates every other human institution we can name. And here's what that impulse created. Not just protection, something far more complicated. Something that would eventually force an entirely different kind of genius to emerge. The genius of breaking walls down. Because the moment the first wall went up, somewhere in that same ancient world, someone was already standing on the other side of it, staring up, thinking, how do I get through that? The answer to that question would take thousands of years to fully develop, but when it did, it would change everything. In the earliest civilizations, Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, walls were primarily made from mud brick. The material was everywhere, easy to shape, cheap enough to build with at scale, and for small threats, it worked. But mud brick had a fatal weakness. It was vulnerable to weather. It required constant repair. It wore out. And as societies grew more complex, as armies got bigger, as the stakes of conflict rose from a neighbor's cattle to an entire kingdom's grain supply, the demand for something more permanent became impossible to ignore. Stone became the dominant choice, offering what mud brick never could, real, lasting strength. But stone brought its own engineering problem. Stone is heavy. Stone requires cutting, shaping, transporting, lifting. Stone requires organization at a scale that makes your head swim when you think about it honestly. To build a stone wall around an entire city, not a room, not a courtyard, an entire city, you need surveyors who can hold a straight line over miles of uneven ground. You need quarry workers. You need transport teams. You need masons who understand how stone layers interact under load, how weight distributes through a structure, how to prevent the slow creep of settling that can bring a wall down over decades. You need supervisors. You need food for all of them. You need water. You need a political structure capable of compelling thousands of people to do brutal physical labor, often under threat of enemy attack, day after day, month after month, until the wall is finished. All of that before a single stone goes up. There was a woman somewhere in the ancient Near East. We will never know her name, no inscription carries it, no relief carves her face, who mixed mortar every single day for what might have been years. Her hands were destroyed by it. The alkaline lime burned through the skin of her palms the way acid burns through paper, slowly, relentlessly. She mixed the mortar that held together walls that armies died trying to breach, walls that appear in history books as the backdrop to famous kings and their famous battles. She appears in none of them. But without her, without 10,000 people exactly like her, none of those walls existed. That is the weight that sits behind every ancient fortification. Not just stone, not just engineering. Sweat, pain, coercion, and anonymous brilliance, pressed into rock and left to endure for millennia. Constructing these walls required a coordinated workforce, often consisting of both skilled laborers and conscripted citizens. Conscripted. That is the polite historical word for forced. Someone told you to pick up a stone and carry it, and the alternative was worse. That truth is baked into the foundations of every wall that ever protected a civilization, and every wall that ever fell trying to resist one. Now, let's talk about what those walls actually had to withstand. Because if you've been picturing an ancient army running up to a city wall with ladders, you're missing almost the entire picture. Fortifications weren't just tall. They were engineered to defeat specific tactics, and the tactics evolved in direct response to the walls. An arms race in stone and wood and rope that ran for thousands of years. As civilizations advanced, fortifications grew more sophisticated, incorporating elements like towers, parapets, and deep moats. The tower wasn't decoration. It was a killing machine built into the architecture of the wall. Step back and think about the geometry. If you have a straight wall and an attacker runs up to the base of it, the defender directly above them can pour boiling water, drop stones, shoot arrows, but the attacker is pressed against the wall itself, almost directly below, in a zone where the angle makes it hard to hit them effectively. The tower solves that problem. A defender in a tower projecting out from the wall has a clear line of sight along the face of the wall in both directions. Anyone approaching the base can be struck from the side rather than from directly above. The tower is not an addition to the wall. It is the wall thinking about itself geometrically and solving its own vulnerability. City walls were built to include gates, watchtowers, and usually a ditch running around the outer perimeter that could be filled with water. A moat is not just a water obstacle. It is a structural argument. A moat prevents the most ancient and effective attack in the siegecraft playbook, the tunnel. Dig under a wall, support the tunnel with wooden beams, then burn the wood. The tunnel collapses, the wall section above it drops. Simple, brutal, effective. A moat filled with water makes tunneling nearly impossible. You cannot dig through a water table. The moat was not a romantic feature on a castle postcard. It was a direct, calculated response to a specific underground threat, and the defenders who added it to their walls understood engineering well enough to know exactly what they were countering. But no wall in the ancient world tells this story with the sheer, overwhelming force of Babylon. Not even close. The walls of Babylon were constructed using mud bricks faced with baked bricks, many of them glazed and inscribed with the name of Nebuchadnezzar. The city was encircled by a double set of walls, with the outer wall measuring up to 80 feet in height, wide enough at the top for a chariot to pass along it. A chariot, on top of the wall. Let that sink in. This was not a barrier. This was infrastructure. You could conduct mobile military operations on the surface of this wall as though it were a road, because that was exactly how it was designed to function. The top of Babylon's wall was a highway for its own defenders, letting troops race from one threatened section to another without descending to street level and fighting through a city. The ancient account of Babylon describes a deep, broad trench full of water ringing the entire structure, then a wall 50 meters in thickness. At the very top, they built chambers of one story facing each other, and between those rows of chambers, they left space to drive a 4-horse chariot. Now, the thickness figure there is almost certainly exaggerated. Ancient writers loved a dramatic number, and scholars note that those dimensions are vastly overstated. The real circumference of Babylon's walls was roughly 8,400 meters, and where the ancient sources claimed 100 gates, archaeological evidence shows there were 8, including the famous Ishtar Gate. 8 gates in a wall circuit that stretches for miles. And the Ishtar Gate was not simply the grandest of the 8, it was a statement, a message. A piece of psychological engineering so sophisticated it operated simultaneously as a military fortification, a religious monument, and a weapon of pure intimidation, aimed not at enemy soldiers, but at enemy minds. The Ishtar Gate was constructed around 569 before the Common Era, by order of King Nebuchadnezzar II on the north side of the city. It was part of a grand walled processional way leading into Babylon itself. The original structure was a double gate, a smaller frontal gate, and a larger, more grandiose secondary section behind it. The walls were finished in glazed bricks, mostly deep blue, with animals and deities rendered in low relief at intervals along the surface. The gate stood 15 meters high, and the original foundations extended another 14 meters underground. 14 meters of foundation below ground. Nearly as much structure below the surface as above it. Because the engineers of Babylon understood something that most people never think about when they look at a building. A wall is not just what you see. The seen part is the argument. The unseen part is what makes the argument hold. Archaeologist Walter Andre deciphered Babylonian fitters' marks, a system of notation embedded in the construction process itself. The making of the Ishtar Gate began by marking out the design on a wall of unadorned bricks, then molding, glazing, and baking each individual brick before fitting them together, like designing and assembling an intricate puzzle at architectural scale. The gate and its processional way represent the peak of molding and glazing technologies developed over the preceding centuries. Every single brick, individually molded, individually glazed, individually baked, then fitted into a structure where the visual design, dragons, bulls, the symbols of gods whose power the king wanted to channel, had to align perfectly across hundreds of thousands of individual pieces. The whole gate was covered in glazed bricks, which inscriptions tell us were made to resemble lapis lazuli, rendering the facade with a jewel-like shine, visible from a distance, that made the jaw drop before a single soldier had drawn a weapon. The master artisans who designed and built the Ishtar Gate were not only skilled technicians, but also artists, historians, and ritual practitioners. They were believed capable of creating artworks that manifested divine power on earth, and the gate, offering entry into the imperial city, was designed to be a magically activated monument. Magically activated. In the language of the time, that meant something specific, not decoration, not theology layered onto an existing structure. The gate was, in the understanding of every person who approached it, inhabited by those gods. Built in dedication to Ishtar, the powerful goddess of love, war, and fertility, one of the most prominent members of the Mesopotamian divine pantheon, it functioned as a declaration. To attack Babylon meant attacking through her gate. It meant, in the theological framework of the ancient Near East, declaring war on the goddess herself. That was not superstition. That was engineering applied to the human mind. The outer structure was stone. The gate was fear. And fear, in the calculus of ancient warfare, was often more impenetrable than any material a mason could lay. A well-fortified city often discouraged potential invaders from attacking in the first place. The sight of massive walls could convince an army to abandon its campaign or negotiate rather than lay siege. Every resource poured into those walls, every brick fired and glazed and fitted into place by exhausted hands, was also an investment in a negotiation strategy. The wall said, "Look what we built. Now imagine what it will cost you to try." For centuries that argument held. Walls decided fate. Walls were civilization's guarantee. The city inside the wall was the world. Everything outside was chaos, wilderness, the enemy's territory. The line between order and annihilation ran through the masonry itself, and as long as nothing existed that could defeat the wall, the city inside it was, effectively, invincible. But something was coming that would tear that guarantee apart. Something that didn't try to go over the wall, or tunnel under it, or starve out the people behind it. Something that simply looked at the wall, calculated the forces involved, and said, "I can break that." As civilization expanded, and fortified cities became the center of political and military power, ancient armies had to develop highly specialized siege engines to conquer these strongholds. This wasn't a gradual, organic process. It was a crisis response. The walls had gotten too good. The defensive advantage had become so overwhelming that any army that met a fortified city without a plan found itself starving in the mud outside those walls, dying of exposure, watching its supplies run out, while the people inside ate and slept and waited. Something had to change. And the change, when it came, didn't look like a revolution at first. It looked like a desperate man in a city on a Sicilian island, surrounded by enemies on all sides, running out of options. The invention of mechanical artillery was traditionally ascribed to the initiative of Dionysius I, tyrant of Syracuse in Sicily, who, in 399 before the Common Era, directed his engineers to construct military engines in preparation for war with Carthage. Facing constant threats, and driven by a relentless desire to maintain and expand his power, Dionysius understood the strategic advantage that superior weaponry could provide. He poured vast resources into what was effectively a state-funded research and development program, attracting the finest engineers, craftsmen, and minds of the era to his court. Dionysius established the first known military-industrial complex around 406 before the Common Era in Syracuse, recruiting artisans and focusing entirely on war innovations. The first weapons research program in recorded history. Run by a tyrant who was smart enough to know he couldn't win by fighting the same way everyone else was fighting. He needed something new, and his engineers delivered something that would make every wall built since Jericho suddenly feel provisional. Among the first results was the gastrophetes, in Greek, the belly bow. In essence, it was a large, powerful, and flexible bow. The flexibility came from the material itself, a composite of wood, horn, and animal sinew. A wood core covered by a tension layer of sinew in front and a compression layer of horn in the back. This, using a sinew bowstring, supplied a propulsive force no single human arm could match. The belly bow. You braced it against your stomach. Your own body weight became part of the loading mechanism. It was louder than a regular bow. It hit harder than anything before it, and it was just the beginning. The gastrophetes was not merely a bigger bow. It was the direct ancestor of all subsequent torsion-powered siege engines. Its fundamental principle, storing energy in tension and twisted material, became the blueprint for everything from the Roman ballistae to the massive later catapults. It represented a monumental leap from purely muscle-powered weapons to sophisticated mechanical devices capable of delivering projectiles with unprecedented force and range. Unprecedented force. That phrase gets used a lot in history writing, and it usually doesn't mean very much. Here, it means something precise. Before the gastrophetes, the maximum force a projectile weapon could deliver was capped by human muscle. By the strength of an arm, a shoulder, a back, every bow, every sling, every thrown stone, all of it bottlenecked at the biology of the person using it. The gastrophetes broke that ceiling. For the first time in human history, the force delivered by a weapon was not limited by human muscle. It was limited only by how cleverly you could store and release energy in wood, horn, and sinew. That insight, once it was out in the world, could not be put back. The machines quickly spread throughout the ancient Mediterranean. Schools and contests emerged at the end of the 4th century before the Common Era, specifically to promote the refinement of machine design. They were so popular in ancient Greece and Rome that competitions were regularly held, and students from Samos, Chios, and especially from Rhodes were highly sought after by military commanders for their catapult construction expertise. There were schools for this, competitions. A culture of engineering innovation built specifically around the problem of making things that could break other things. The arms race between wall and weapon had become formalized, institutionalized. Young men studied the physics of force and projectile motion the way other young men studied rhetoric or philosophy. Because in that world, understanding how to launch a stone accurately enough to demolish a specific section of a specific wall was worth more than knowing how to argue a legal case. Mechanical artillery of this era was of two fundamental types, tension and torsion. In the first, energy to drive the projectile was provided by the tension of a drawn bow. In the second, it was provided by torsional energy stored in bundles of twisted fibers. Torsion. That word is the pivot point of the entire history of ancient siege warfare. Tension weapons used the spring of a bent material, the natural recoil of something trying to straighten itself out. Torsion weapons used something different, something that felt almost violent in its mechanical logic. You take a bundle of fibers, sinew, rope, or something far more surprising, and you twist them. You twist them until they are wound so tight that the resistance they offer to further twisting is enormous. You attach an arm to that bundle. You force the arm down against the pressure of those coiled, screaming fibers. You load your projectile, and then you release. When released, the torsion, also called torque, generated by the twisted ropes, snapped the arm upward with explosive force, propelling the projectile forward and high into the air toward the target. The torsion systems in ballistae and onagers utilized twisted skeins of sinew or hair to store and release energy. These devices were vital for propelling projectiles with significant force and required precisely crafted components to maintain their resilience. Hair, not metaphorically, literally. In ancient Roman tradition, women were said to have given up their hair for use in catapults, the most intimate material on a human body, bundled and twisted into a machine of war. The private becomes the lethal. There is something almost unbearable about that image. Someone's grandmother's hair, coiled inside a wooden frame on a battlefield, about to hurl death through the air. The ballista came out of this torsion revolution. Resembling a giant crossbow, the ballista utilized torsion springs made from twisted ropes or animal sinew to propel bolts or stones at enemy targets with a level of accuracy that allowed operators to eliminate specific threats, including enemy siege equipment and individual personnel. The ballista was a highly accurate weapon, with many accounts, right from its early history, of single soldiers being picked off by its operators. Imagine that. Standing on top of a city wall, fully armored, 100 yards from the nearest enemy position, and a bolt arrives with enough precision to find you specifically. That is not a weapon of area suppression. That is a weapon of targeted killing, operating at a range no one before had thought possible. Defenders on walls had been, until this point, largely safe from counterfire. The ballista ended that safety. Then came the onager, named after a wild donkey because of what it did when it fired. The onager took its name from the furious, bucking recoil it produced when fired, a kick so violent it required a specially built timber platform to absorb the impact. The onager was a torsion-powered machine, consisting of a sturdy wooden frame and a large horizontal beam acting as the throwing arm, mounted with twisted ropes or sinew at one end. Named after a wild donkey for its powerful kicking action, it used that single large arm to hurl projectiles from a bucket or sling. The other end of the arm was pulled down to the ground, where it was loaded with a projectile, typically a stone or incendiary material, such as a burning bowl of oil, held in a sling or bucket. A burning bowl of oil. Fire from a distance. Not a flaming arrow that might flutter out in flight. A bowl of burning liquid, hurled through the air in a sling, arriving at the target while still on fire. The gates of ancient cities were made of wood. They burned. The onager turned fire into artillery. As a single-armed torsion catapult, the onager worked differently from the two-armed ballista. Its design was essentially a single stout arm surrounded by thick, twisted cords, and the energy those cords could store was staggering. Not a gentleman's application of force, a savage, lurching, bone-deep violence of stored potential energy suddenly unleashed in a single heartbeat. The Assyrians, centuries before the Greeks formalized torsion mechanics, were the first to have a permanent corps of engineers in their army, and they applied iron in new ways, including inventing an iron-headed battering ram, giving them a decisive advantage in siege warfare. The Assyrian army was an extraordinarily organized war machine. It carried with it a dedicated corps of siege engineers and sappers. While the battering rams worked against the walls, and the siege ramps were built up toward them, tunnels were simultaneously being dug beneath the foundations. 3 attacks at once. The wall from the outside, directly, the wall from above, via the ramp, and the wall from below, via the tunnel. The Assyrians didn't just bring an army to a siege, they brought a system, a comprehensive, multi-axis engineering solution to the problem of a fortified city, refined over generations of brutal practice. Hundreds of laborers worked day and night, likely in 2 shifts of 12 hours each, carrying stones to build the siege ramps. The manpower was almost certainly supplied by prisoners of war and forced labor drawn from the local population. In the final stage of the Lachish ramp construction, wooden beams were laid on top of the stones, where battering rams within their massive siege machines, weighing up to a full ton, were positioned. The ram itself was a large, heavy wooden beam with a metal tip, battered the walls by swinging backward and forward on suspension. Researchers believe the ram was hung on metal chains rather than rope, as rope would have worn out too quickly under the stress. Indeed, an iron chain was found at the top of the actual ramp at Lachish during excavation. The Assyrian siege ramp at Lachish is the only surviving physical example of their military capability in the entire Near East. Every other ramp is gone, collapsed, eroded, built over. This one endures because the city it conquered was abandoned. The ramp outlasted the civilization that built it, and the civilization it destroyed. You can go and stand on it today. Think about what that means. You can walk up the same gradient that soldiers walked up in the 7th century before the Common Era, pushing a machine that weighed a ton, under arrow fire from the walls above them, sweating through the pre-dawn dark, knowing that when the ram finally hit the wall, either it would give or they would die. The ground beneath your feet has not changed. The physics has not changed. The desperation has not changed. The fact that the Lachish siege ramp is still in place over 2,000 years after it was built, while the city it helped conquer is long gone, is its own kind of testimony to the skills of the engineers who constructed it. The ramp remained. Engineering outlasts everything it destroys. And yet for all their brutality, for all their iron-headed genius, the Assyrians, and the Greeks who followed with their belly bows and torsion springs, and the Romans who followed them with their onagers and ballistae, all of them were still working within a constraint that nobody had yet broken. The constraint of the arm, of the swing, of the length of the lever and the strength of the twisted rope. The machines were getting bigger, more powerful, more accurate, but there was a ceiling on that power, written into the physics of twisted fiber, and by the time Rome was building its empire in stone and blood, that ceiling was beginning to show. Somewhere far to the east, in a world the Romans barely knew existed, engineers were staring at a different problem from a different angle, and they were about to find a solution that didn't twist rope at all, that didn't rely on fiber at all. That didn't require any stored tension in any material whatsoever, because it was powered by something that never ran out, never snapped under load, never wore away with use, required no maintenance, and was available everywhere on Earth at any moment. It was powered by falling. Not metaphorically, literally. The weight of a heavy object dropping straight down through space, obeying nothing more complicated than gravity, converted through a lever arm into a velocity that could hurl a stone the weight of a grown man over a distance that made defenders on city walls feel, for the first time, genuinely, viscerally helpless. No twisted rope, no stored tension fighting to uncoil, just mass and height and the oldest force in the universe doing exactly what it always does. The counterweight trebuchet, the machine that changed everything. But to understand why it changed everything, you need to understand what it felt like to be on the receiving end of the machines that came before it. And then to understand why even those machines, terrifying as they were, still left defenders with something to hold on to, something to calculate, something to plan around. Because the dirty secret of ancient siege warfare is this: for most of its history, the defenders held the advantage. The masonry was almost always stronger than the weapon trying to break it. The mathematics of ancient fortification was not designed to stop attackers forever. It was designed to buy time, to exhaust the besieging army's food supply, wear down its morale, drag the siege out until disease or desertion did what the walls themselves were doing, telling the enemy, "This is not worth it." That calculation was razor close for centuries. And when it finally broke, it broke in a specific place, at a specific moment, in a way that no general on either side fully understood until it was already over. Stand outside Rhodes in 305 before the Common Era. The harbor is still and cold in the early morning, and the smell of salt and charred timber hangs over everything. Demetrius Poliorcetes, his name means "the one who besieges cities," a title he earned rather than inherited, has brought the most sophisticated siege train ever assembled to crack this island city, and he is furious. He has been here for over a year. Demetrius Poliorcetes was renowned throughout the ancient world as one of the most accomplished siege engineers of his era. His father was one of Alexander the Great's leading generals, and Demetrius had inherited both ambition and tactical brilliance. He used everything available to him: ballistae, catapults, towers, fire ships. His most famous instrument was the helepolis, a monstrous 9-story rolling siege tower that ancient sources claimed stood nearly 40 meters high. It was armored in iron plates on its lower 2 stories to resist fire arrows. It rolled on wheels. It bristled with artillery at multiple levels. Nothing like it had ever been built. Nothing like it had ever been pointed at a city wall. And Rhodes held. Not because the Rhodians were superhuman fighters, not because their walls were impregnable. They held because of something that didn't require a single new machine or a single new tactic. They held because of systematic, precise, engineering-based analysis of the weapons being used against them. The Rhodians studied the trajectory of incoming projectiles, those ancient sinew-powered ballistic arcs, and realized something profound. The torsion engines had a ceiling in range, a ceiling in accuracy at that range, a ceiling in the weight of projectile they could reliably throw. The defenders mapped those limitations with the same care a surveyor maps terrain. They positioned their most exposed personnel exactly outside effective range. They placed their counter-artillery at angles that took advantage of firing downhill, maximizing the energy their own bolts carried at the point of impact. They redirected approaches to channel the Helepolis over soft ground, where it sank into the earth under its own weight, slowed, became a target rather than a threat. When Demetrius finally abandoned the siege, he left the Helepolis behind. The Rhodians sold it as scrap metal and used the proceeds to build the Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a monument funded by a defeated weapon. That is the moment. That is what the commanders on both sides saw and understood. The torsion system had reached its mechanical limit. The arms race had been running for 2 centuries, and the defenders had learned to read it, measure it, engineer responses to it. Something categorically different was needed. Not a bigger catapult, not a stronger sinew bundle, not a taller tower. Something that operated on a different physical principle entirely. Something whose power scaled not with the quality of twisted fiber, but with the mass you could pile into a counterweight box, in a direct and unambiguous line. More weight meant more force, without ceiling, without diminishing returns, without the fatigue life of sinew imposing its inevitable limit. On the morning after the trebuchet's first shot landed, every defensive calculation in the ancient world was already obsolete, and almost nobody knew it yet. Let's talk about what actually happens when a siege weapon fires at a stone wall. Not in the polished language of physics textbooks, in the language of the wall itself. Stone, even well-laid, carefully jointed, centuries-old stone, is not a single rigid object. It is a system under permanent, invisible stress. Gravity is pressing down on every block from above. The ground is pushing up from below. The structure is in constant equilibrium between those 2 forces, and that equilibrium is what holds it together. The mortar between the stones is not glue. It is a filler, a gap bridger. It transfers load. It distributes stress. It is absolutely not designed to absorb impact. When a projectile, say a rounded riverstone the weight of a full-grown adult, launched by a counterweight trebuchet at terminal velocity, hits that structure, it does not simply chip away at the surface. It introduces a third force into the system, perpendicular to the load the masonry was built to handle. The impact sends a shock wave through the stone matrix. That wave travels in all directions simultaneously, up, down, sideways, deep into the core of the structure. Every crack, every small void, every hairline imperfection in the mortar becomes a point of catastrophic stress concentration. The shockwave finds those points the way water finds cracks in pavement. It doesn't have to break the stone. It has to break the relationships between stones, loosen the mortar there, crack the keystone here, shift the load distribution just enough that the weight the wall has been quietly managing for centuries suddenly has nowhere to go. Then the next stone hits, and the next. Archaeologists working at siege sites have found evidence of this process written directly into surviving masonry. At the site of ancient Dura Europos on the Euphrates, The Roman-era fortifications show patterns of impact damage that reveal something stunning about how the attackers worked. They did not fire randomly. They concentrated their shots on specific sections with geometric precision, targeting corners, targeting the junction between wall and tower, targeting the spots where structural load was highest, and therefore where the introduction of shock would do the most damage. The siege engineers were doing structural analysis in their heads, without calculus, without engineering software, without modern stress testing tools. They were reading a fortification the way a doctor reads a body, looking for the point where it was already under the most strain and hitting it there, repeatedly, systematically, until the math broke. Now picture the people inside when those stones began to fall. There was a boy. We know approximately how old he was because of what archaeologists found in the rubble of a siege site in the Near East. A small skeleton pressed against the interior face of a wall, in a position suggesting he had been crouching there, covering his ears, who heard a sound he had no frame of reference for, a sound like the sky breaking. The impact of a siege stone against a fortification wall has been estimated at a force capable of shaking the ground for 100 meters in every direction. Not just a boom, a physical event, a vibration that passed through the soles of your feet, up through your body, rattled the water in a cup, knocked plaster from the ceiling of every room within range. Imagine that sound, arriving without warning in a city that had never been besieged before. Imagine being that boy. The masonry is shaking. The air smells of limestone dust. The adults around you are running and shouting, but their words are swallowed in the next impact. And then the next. And the rhythm of it, the terrible, mechanical, patient rhythm of a trebuchet crew working in rotation, tells you something far worse than fear. It tells you, this is organized, this is planned, this is not going to stop. The psychological effect of sustained bombardment was understood by ancient commanders as a distinct weapon in itself. Vitruvius, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, discussed the importance of keeping artillery fire steady and rhythmic precisely because the anticipation of the next impact was often more destructive to morale than the impact itself. The pause between shots was engineered to be unbearable. The crew loaded while you waited. You knew it was coming. You did not know where it would land. Ancient torsion engines could achieve a rate of fire of approximately 2 to 3 shots per minute when operated by a well-trained crew. The counterweight trebuchet, slower to reset, traded rate of fire for sheer destructive mass. But a coordinated battery of trebuchets, multiple machines firing in sequence, staggered so that a stone was always in the air, could maintain almost continuous bombardment. Ancient accounts of major sieges describe defenders unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to hold formations under the relentless pace of incoming fire. Sleep deprivation alone, sustained over weeks, will break any defensive force that artillery cannot breach directly. That was the full picture of ancient ballistics, not a single moment of heroic physics, but a sustained, calculated, multi-layered attack on both the masonry and the mind of every person sheltering behind it. And at the center of this machine, standing just outside the effective range of the defender's return fire, usually indistinguishable from the crew around him in his dust and exhaustion, was the person nobody in the history books thought to name, the engineer. We know what the generals looked like. We know what the kings decreed. We have their statues, their inscriptions, their self-commissioned reliefs carved in stone, showing them in postures of triumph above cowering enemies. But the men who actually designed the machines, calibrated the counterweights, selected the timber, calculated the trajectory adjustments for wind and range, they are almost universally anonymous. Not because their work was considered unimportant, because in the ancient world, the social category of engineer was genuinely ambiguous. Were they craftsmen? Were they scholars? Were they soldiers? They fit no clean box, and the ancient record-keeping reflected that ambiguity by largely failing to keep records of them at all. The exceptions are striking precisely because they are exceptions. We know the name Archimedes not because his contemporaries built him monuments, they didn't, but because the story of his death was dramatic enough to survive. Killed by a Roman soldier during the siege of Syracuse in 212 before the Common Era, allegedly while working on a mathematical problem drawn in the sand, too absorbed in his calculations to notice the city had fallen. The soldier who killed him was reportedly punished afterward, because Marcellus, the Roman general who had besieged the city, had specifically ordered Archimedes taken alive. Why? What was it about this one engineer that made the commanding general of the conquering army want him preserved?
Because for 2 years, Archimedes had held Syracuse against the most powerful military force in the Mediterranean world.
Not with supernatural walls, not with a miraculous army, with machines. Specifically, with machines of his own design that the Roman commanders had no answer for and no precedent to understand. He had constructed a system of cranes that could reach over the fortifications of the city, seize Roman ships by the prow, lift the front end clear of the water, shake the crew loose like dice from a cup, then drop the hull back down hard enough to swamp it. He had arranged artillery along the city walls at multiple heights and ranges, so that as Roman ships approached at different distances, they came under fire from progressively different weapons. Long range first, then medium, then close range as they came within the harbor mouth, creating an overlapping kill zone with no safe corridor. He had arranged, according to ancient sources, a system of mirrors or polished bronze shields that could concentrate sunlight onto Roman sails and set them alight at a distance. That last one remains debated.
But the cranes and the artillery are beyond debate. We have enough corroborating sources. And the point is not any individual invention. The point is the thinking behind them. Archimedes was not responding tactically to Roman maneuvers. He was thinking about the entire problem of the harbor defense as a system, identifying the gaps, designing solutions, and implementing them fast enough to stay ahead of the most experienced military force in the ancient world. Marcellus, by the end of those 2 years, had reportedly stopped trying to attack and started trying to outlast, waiting for a moment of weakness rather than risking another assault against machines he didn't understand. He described Archimedes to his staff, according to Plutarch, with something close to bitter admiration. He called him a geometrical Briareus, a 100-armed monster, but made of mathematics rather than myth. That is the pressure these engineers were under, not the pressure of academic competition or professional rivalry, the pressure of a Roman army outside the fortifications. The pressure of a city full of people whose survival depended on your next idea being better than Rome's last one. The pressure of knowing that the moment your solution was understood, reverse-engineered, and countered, which it would be, because the Romans were very good at that, you needed to already have the next one ready. Some of those engineers did not survive their own work. Mechanics employed in sieges were regularly targeted by defenders specifically because of their role. A 1st-century text on Roman military practice notes that catapult operators were identified and killed as a priority, because a battery of siege engines without its expert operator was dramatically less effective than the same battery with him. The engineer was a strategic target. His death was a military objective. There were engineers who died in the trenches they dug, killed by sorties from the gates they were trying to breach. There were engineers who built machines on explicit promise of payment and freedom. Many were slaves or freedmen and received neither when the siege ended. There were engineers who innovated under such pressure, in such haste, that the machines they built killed their own crews when improperly assembled or when a component failed under load. A sinew bundle snapping under full torsion could strike with the force of a whip, moving faster than the eye could follow. Men lost hands, lost eyes, died, and yet they kept refining. The gastrophetes became the ballista. The ballista became the caroballista, a torsion engine mounted on a cart, mobile and deployable anywhere on a battlefield in minutes. The catapult grew until it was firing stones that could crack the corner of a stone tower with a single impact. The trebuchet grew until its counterweight box held more stone than most homes held furniture. Each generation of engineers inherited the problems the last one had partially solved, identified the next bottleneck, and pushed through it. What drove them is not hard to understand. Some were driven by survival. Serve the tyrant well enough and you keep your head. Some were driven by resources. The patronage of a wealthy commander was the only way to pursue an engineering problem at scale in the ancient world. You needed the budget of a small city to build a trebuchet.
Some were driven by the pure, addictive pressure of a specific problem that had no solution yet. What it feels like to solve an engineering problem under combat conditions has been described, in fragments, by enough sources to assemble something like a composite picture. It feels, according to those fragments, like two things simultaneously. The quiet, almost cold satisfaction of a calculation coming out right, and the sick fear that you miscalculated and will not know it until the machine fires and someone dies. Those two feelings do not cancel each other out. They coexist. They are the emotional texture of the work. The Romans formalized this. What the Greeks had kept as a loose tradition of individual genius patronized by individual commanders, Rome converted into institutional practice. By the late Republic, a Roman legion on campaign carried its own organic engineering capability. Surveyors, sappers, carpenters, artillery specialists, all under military discipline, all drawing military pay, all subject to military law. The legionary camp was built to a standard pattern, not because Romans lacked imagination, but because a standard pattern could be built in the dark by exhausted men who knew exactly where everything went without being told. Standardization was a form of engineering genius, the genius of removing decision fatigue from people operating at the edge of their physical limit. And those legionary engineers left traces, not monuments, not statues, not inscriptions with their names, traces in the ground, traces in the stone itself.
When archaeologists began excavating ancient fortification sites in the 19th and 20th centuries, they expected to find evidence of destruction. They found it. What they did not expect to find, what surprised almost every team that encountered it, was evidence of the defenders' technical response. Inscribed in the surviving masonry, buried in collapse layers, preserved under rubble that had been undisturbed for 2,000 years, were engineering solutions that had never been documented in any text. At Dura Europos, during the Sassanid siege of around 256 of the Common Era, archaeologists found a countermine. Not a mine, a countermine. The Sassanid attackers had dug tunnels under the Roman fortifications with the intention of collapsing the foundations. Standard procedure: pack the tunnel with combustible material, ignite it, let the supports burn away, bring the wall section down from underneath. The Romans had detected the tunneling through the vibration transmitted through the ground itself, through the subtle subsidence of the floor surface above the tunnel's advancing tip, possibly through the ancient practice of placing a drum skin or a shield flat on the earth and watching whether it trembled with the impact of picks working below, and had dug their own tunnel to intercept the attacker's tunnel before it could reach the wall. The two tunnels met. What archaeologists found inside was the collapsed result of a subterranean battle fought in complete darkness, in a space barely wide enough for two men to pass, with fire and suffocation as the primary weapons. The Sassanid attackers had tried to use burning sulfur compounds to drive the Romans out of the countermine. The Roman response, according to the physical evidence, involved pushing back with their own incendiaries and collapsing the tunnel deliberately on top of the attackers. The remains of multiple soldiers were found at the point of contact. They had been there, undisturbed, for 1,700 years. The mine and countermine at Dura Europos represent one of the most complete surviving pictures of siege warfare's subterranean dimension anywhere in the archaeological record. But beyond their historical significance, they reveal something about the nature of ancient military engineering that no written summary captures. The problem was never just the machine. The problem was the machine, the countermeasure, and the countermeasure, locked in a dynamic that escalated recursively, each side's engineering solution generating the next side's engineering problem, in a loop that had no natural stopping point. What defenders embedded in their masonry went beyond countermines. At various excavated sites, archaeologists have found structural modifications that reveal sophisticated understanding of projectile mechanics. Sloped bases, what military architects called a talus or a batter, were added to the lower sections of fortifications specifically to deflect incoming projectiles. A stone hitting a vertical surface transfers most of its energy directly into the structure. The same stone hitting a surface angled at roughly 45 degrees skids off, losing most of its energy to friction and deflection rather than penetration. The engineers who added batters to existing walls were responding to the specific flight characteristics of trebuchet projectiles, not catapult bolts. The high, steep angle of trebuchet fire made the batter especially effective against that particular threat. That is not guesswork. It is reverse engineering from the geometry of the modification. You can examine a batter on an ancient fortification and deduce which weapon the builders were defending against, because the angle is calibrated to the specific trajectory of the incoming projectile type.
Masonry is a record of the threat it was engineered to answer. At Masada, Herod's fortress in the Judean desert, archaeologists found a defensive feature the Roman army outside almost certainly never detected. Behind the exterior facing of the casemate wall, a double wall system with rooms between the inner and outer faces, the builders had integrated concealed storage chambers directly into the wall structure itself. Structurally, these chambers altered the mass distribution of the wall in ways that affected how it responded to impact loading. The outer face, under assault, would absorb and partially redistribute force into a cavity, rather than transmitting the full shockwave to the inner face where defenders stood. The Romans breached the outer structure at a single point, never penetrating the full depth of the casemate system. Those interior chambers survived intact. The casemate design at Masada was not an accident of layout. It was an engineering decision that created a wall which behaved differently under impact than a solid wall of equivalent external dimensions, absorbing and dispersing force rather than transmitting it cleanly through to the interior. The Roman engineers calculating how much battering the structure could absorb before collapse were, unknowingly, working with the wrong model of what they were hitting. Ancient Greek defenders, according to multiple textual sources, used another technique that left its mark in the archaeological record: deliberate structural weakening of specific wall sections. Looser construction in a targeted area, engineered to give way under pressure at a controlled moment, collapsing inward onto the attacking force that had breached it, burying them under tons of masonry in the very instant of their apparent victory. Think about the engineering sophistication that requires. You're constructing a section of your own defensive wall to fail on a specific load threshold. You are calculating the point at which attacker pressure will trigger the collapse, and calibrating the construction quality of that section to match. You are solving a structural problem in reverse, designing for failure rather than strength, with as much precision as you design the rest for permanence. The goal is not to resist the breach. The goal is to control it, to turn the moment of the attacker's success into the mechanism of his destruction. Now let's talk about what gunpowder did to all of it. The walls did not fall all at once. That is the first thing to understand about what gunpowder did to the ancient and medieval world of fortification. Not a single catastrophic moment, but a slow, grinding, irreversible realization that spread from city to city, from commander to commander, from engineer to engineer, like a fire that starts in one corner of a room and then, quietly, catches the ceiling. The weapon that broke the old system was not, in its earliest form, particularly impressive. The first gunpowder compositions used in warfare were not precision instruments. They were experiments, dangerous, unpredictable, frequently lethal to the people deploying them. The Chinese, who developed gunpowder sometime around the 9th century of the Common Era, initially used it in fire weapons, incendiary arrows, bombs, devices designed to burn rather than to blast. The logic was familiar. Fire had been a siege weapon since before recorded history. Gunpowder was, in that first phase, simply a more energetic way to deliver it. But fire is not physics in the way an explosion is physics. Fire can be extinguished, survived, contained. What gunpowder eventually became was something categorically different. A controlled detonation, contained in a metal tube, using rapidly expanding gas to accelerate a dense projectile to velocities that no sinew bundle, no counterweight, no mechanical lever of any design had ever approached. And at those velocities, the physics of what happened to a stone wall changed completely and permanently. A cannonball removes that agency entirely. A dense iron sphere arriving at the velocities early cannon achieved carries kinetic energy so concentrated, delivered across so small a contact point, so instantaneously,
that the wall's internal load distribution has no time to engage. The shockwave moves through the stone faster than the stone's structural system can respond. The result is not progressive weakening, but instant localized destruction, a section of masonry that simply ceases to exist at the point of impact, with the material behind the strike face driven inward as a lethal secondary spray, killing defenders not on the outer face, but in the courtyards and streets behind the wall. By debris moving at speeds no one sheltering inside had any reason to anticipate. The first commanders who faced early artillery did not immediately understand what they were seeing. The reports that survive from early gunpowder sieges describe a consistent pattern of disbelief. Defenders who had trained their entire military lives in the calculus of torsion and counterweight bombardment, who knew how to read a battery, predict its rhythm, reinforce its target zones, repair damage between barrages, suddenly found themselves inside a system whose engineering rules had changed without warning. The rhythm was different. The sound was physically unlike anything sinew or falling stone produced. The damage was different in kind, not just in magnitude, and the concussive shock of the gun firing, felt in the chest, in the bones, in the stomach, was something that no amount of experience under torsion artillery had prepared the body for. Constantinople in 1453 is the moment historians point to most often when they want to mark the line between the old world of masonry defense and the new world of gunpowder. And it is the right moment, but not for the reason most people think. The fortifications of Constantinople were not ordinary walls. The Theodosian system, built in the early 5th century of the Common Era, was the most sophisticated defensive engineering the ancient and medieval world had ever produced. Not the tallest, not the thickest, the most systematically engineered, triple-layered. The outermost element, a low parapet and a water-filled moat. Behind it, a second wall of moderate height with towers at regular intervals. Behind that, the main curtain, nearly 12 meters tall and 5 meters thick, with towers projecting outward at intervals calculated so that archers in adjacent towers could deliver overlapping fire across the full face of the curtain between them without a dead zone. The towers were built to different heights in a deliberate stagger, allowing archers on elevated towers to fire over defenders on lower ones without interference. The entire system was staggered in depth, so that an attacker who breached the first element found himself exposed in a killing ground between walls, under fire from 3 directions simultaneously, with no cover and no viable retreat corridor. These fortifications had held for over 1,000 years, not occasionally, continuously. Every force that looked at Constantinople and decided to try had been turned back. The Avars, the Arabs, the Bulgars, the Rus, the Crusaders, who eventually entered the city only through treachery rather than direct assault. The Theodosian system had never been broken by force, not once, in 1,000 years of active defense. Mehmed II brought it down in 53 days. He did it with a cannon. Specifically, with a cannon cast by a Hungarian engineer named Urban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI, been told the treasury could not afford him, and then walked across the lines to the Ottoman camp, where Mehmed paid him what he asked. Urban's cannon was so large that ancient sources claimed it took 60 oxen to move it. The precise figure was almost certainly lower. It does not matter. What matters is what it did to the engineering of those walls. The cannon fired a stone ball. Later versions fired iron, of enormous mass, at velocities the Theodosian system had simply never been designed to withstand. Not because the engineers who built those walls were ignorant, because they were not ignorant of anything that existed when they built them. They had solved the problem in front of them, completely and brilliantly, and the problem had then changed in a way no engineer alive in the 5th century could have had any framework to predict. Urban's cannon cracked the outer curtain at the point of impact with such force that the masonry debris it generated became secondary projectiles that killed Byzantine defenders inside the fortification system without a single Ottoman soldier crossing the moat. The defenders could not repair fast enough. Each night they filled the breaches with rubble, timber,
Bales of wool, anything with enough mass and compliance to blunt the next barrage. Each morning the cannon fired again and opened the breach wider. The wool absorbed some of the shock energy through deformation. The rubble gave the next shot less intact structure to grip, but the physics was patient and it was relentless, and it had no morale to break and no supply lines to exhaust. On the 29th of May, 1453, the fortifications that had defined the eastern boundary of civilization for 1,000 years were breached. The city fell before nightfall. Now look at what the archaeological record shows happened next, because this is where the engineering story doesn't end. It accelerates. The engineers who survived Constantinople, on both sides, immediately began working on the same problem from opposite directions. Ottoman engineers studied the breach patterns left by Urban's cannon and started developing techniques for maximizing the structural damage of each shot, targeting the base of towers rather than the curtain face between them, because the base was where the tower's load path converged, and therefore where a single critical crack would propagate furthest through the structure before the stone above it redistributed the load. Defenders across Europe studied the same breach patterns and arrived at an architectural response that turned the logic of the old masonry wall completely inside out. The Star Fort, the Trace Italienne, a fortification geometry designed from first principles around the specific mechanical behavior of iron cannonballs. Instead of tall vertical walls that presented a large face to incoming fire and transferred impact force straight through to the interior, the new designs were low, massively thick, and angled. Earthworks backed by stone. Angled bastions that projected outward in a geometry that eliminated dead zones, and, more importantly, deflected cannonballs rather than receiving them perpendicular. The same physical logic as the ancient batter applied now at the scale of an entire fortification system, redesigned from the foundation up in response to a new ballistic reality. The engineers who drew those designs were in direct conversation, technically, mechanically, structurally, with the engineers who had added batters to ancient walls 2,000 years before them. They had never read each other's notes. They arrived at the same geometric solution because the physics of deflecting an incoming projectile does not change with the century. The problem was the same. The answer was the same. The material was different. The scale was different. The weapon was different. The geometry was identical. That is what the ruins are still telling us, if you know how to read them. Not metaphor, not poetry. Engineering data, preserved in stone and earthwork and collapse pattern, transmitting solutions across centuries to anyone with the tools to extract them. The science of archaeometry has transformed what we can pull from ancient fortification sites. Ground-penetrating radar now reveals buried structural features without excavation. Hidden chambers, collapsed tunnels, the subsurface outlines of demolished towers, the foundation footprint of walls torn down centuries ago. Laser scanning produces three-dimensional models of surviving masonry at millimeter accuracy, allowing structural engineers today to run load calculations the ancient builders performed empirically, and to confirm, with a frequency that is genuinely humbling, that those ancient builders got it right. The load distribution in the surviving sections of the Theodosian system, modeled in modern structural software, shows stress patterns consistent with optimal design for the material properties of 5th century Roman brick and mortar. These were not approximations of good engineering, they were achievements of it. Stable isotope analysis of mortar and stone can now identify where the materials came from, which quarry, which geological deposit, sometimes which specific extraction period. At several sites in the Near East, this analysis has revealed repair sections using stone quarried from sources hundreds of miles from the original material. That is a specific engineering story. The local quarry was exhausted, or access was cut off, perhaps because an enemy force controlled the approaches and close-range quarrying was tactically impossible. The repair team used what they could transport from further away, under operational constraints. The mortar chemistry is different. The bond characteristics are different. Under certain loading conditions, those repair sections behave differently from the original construction. And under bombardment, they failed first. Not randomly, predictably. Because the material science said they would. That is not speculation about ancient intentions. It is a chemical signature in lime aggregate, pointing directly at a specific engineering decision made under pressure 2,000 years ago, now readable by mass spectrometry in the 21st century. At Hattusa, the ancient Hittite capital in modern Turkey, the foundation courses of the outer fortification reveal a construction technique that rewrote the understanding of how Hittite engineers approached lateral force resistance. The foundation stones were laid not in horizontal courses, but in a deliberately irregular three-dimensional matrix. Some stones set diagonally, some at compound angles, creating a foundation that distributed load in 3 dimensions rather than 2. A structural engineer looking at that foundation pattern immediately recognizes it as a design for resisting horizontal impact force, the specific load signature of a battering ram. The Hittite engineers had designed their foundations 3,000 years ago around the mechanical behavior of the specific weapon being used against them, not as a retrofit, as a foundational decision made before the first stone was placed, encoded into the base of the structure where it would be invisible once the wall was complete, and would never appear in any written record. A defense hidden below the surface, legible only to someone who has already demolished the structure built on top of it. Every excavated siege site, examined with the tools now available, reveals the same fundamental truth. The engineering did not stop at the wall face. It continued in every layer below the surface, in every modification to the original design, in every repair section with its different mortar chemistry, in every angled foundation stone, in every countermine gallery, in every deliberately weakened section calculated to fail on a specific load threshold at a specific moment. The entire structure, from foundation to parapet, was an active engineering response to a specific and evolving threat. And every change to that structure is a datable, measurable record of how that threat changed. When you stand in front of any surviving fortification from the ancient world, any wall at all, any ruin, any fragment of dressed stone still bearing the tool marks of the mason who shaped it, what you are standing in front of is a set of engineering calculations made by people working under conditions of genuine danger, with incomplete information, using the best material science available to them to solve a problem that was trying to kill the people they were responsible for protecting. The cracks record where the calculations met their limit. The repairs record the engineering response to that limit. The geometry of the talus, the angle of the tower projection, the depth of the foundation below grade, the chemistry of the mortar in the repair sections. These are data, measurable, extractable, comparable across sites and centuries. And the data reveals something that no written history of ancient warfare makes fully explicit. The engineers on both sides of every siege were solving the same problem from opposite directions, and each solution one side found forced the other side to find a better one. The gastrophetes forced better walls forced the ballista. The ballista forced arrow slits engineered to specific angular tolerances. The onager forced fire-resistant gate construction. The trebuchet forced the batter and the earthwork backing. The cannon forced the star fort. The star fort forced the development of explosive shells that could arc over the low profile rather than hitting it directly. Every step in that sequence is recoverable from the physical record. The ruins are not silent. They are transmitting continuously, in the language of load paths and impact craters and mortar chemistry and foundation geometry, a complete technical history of the most consequential arms race in human history. And somewhere in that record, in the transition zone between the last generation of masonry fortifications and the first generation of gunpowder defenses, in the breach patterns at Constantinople, in the design drawings for the first star forts, in the engineering calculations that determined the optimal angle of a sloped earthwork face for deflecting a cast iron sphere at a specific velocity, somewhere in that data is a moment when the engineers on both sides simultaneously understood something that had never been understood before. That fortification and artillery had reached a kind of mechanical equilibrium, that the fort could be designed to survive the gun, and the gun could be redesigned to defeat the fort, and this cycle would continue, and continue, and continue, without a natural stopping point, because the physics had no preference for either side. That realization, that the arms race between protection and destruction had no terminus, no final solution, no point at which one side would simply win, is the engineering insight that the ruins have been holding since the walls of Constantinople came down. It took until the 20th century for the full implications of that insight to become undeniable. The weapon that finally made all fortification permanently obsolete did not breach walls. It erased the distinction between the defended space and the undefended space entirely, and the engineers who built it understood, from the very beginning, that no wall could answer it. Not because the wall wasn't strong enough,
Because the category of wall had ceased to be a relevant engineering response to the threat.
the Theodosian engineers could not have imagined that weapon.
But the logic that produced it runs in an unbroken line from the moment the first person stood on the other side of the first wall at Jericho and started thinking about how to get through.